I maintain the automated systems at the Garrison Point Lighthouse. It's mostly computer work these days, checking sensors, updating weather data, monitoring the LED beacon. The old Fresnel lens sits in a museum now, though sometimes I wish we still used it. At least then, I'd understand what's happening to the light. The anomalies started 3 months ago. Small discrepancies at first. The automated logs showed the wrong dates. System clocks losing or gaining hours at random. I assumed it was software errors until I noticed the pattern. The timestamps weren't random. They were real dates, just not from our time. The logs showed the light guiding ships that hadn't existed for a century. Vessels lost to history, somehow still finding their way by our beacon. Each night, the system recorded more of them, ghostly signatures of ships long since claimed by the sea, all following our light through time. I started tracking them properly after that. Each ship's signature came with historical data, where it had sailed from, where it was going, when it was lost. Some were famous shipwrecks, others so obscure they'd been forgotten by all but the most detailed of maritime records. But here's the strange part. According to the logs, we were saving them. The light wasn't just recording these ships from the past, it was changing their courses. Vessels marked in history as lost at sea were somehow finding safe harbor, guided by a lighthouse that wouldn't be automated for another 100 years. Last week, I found my predecessor's notes hidden in the old logbooks. The previous keeper had noticed it too, the way time behaved strangely around the light, the way it seemed to reach across decades. Their notes became increasingly detailed, mapping out patterns in the temporal anomalies. They discovered that the lighthouse doesn't just transmit light, it transmits time itself. Each sweep of the beacon cuts through years like a blade, illuminating different time periods. With each rotation, ships lost in a fog a century ago catch glimpses of the future in our light. Modern vessels sometimes see phantom harbors from the past. The automated systems weren't malfunctioning. They were adapting to the lighthouse's true nature, learning to guide ships not just through space, but through time. Yesterday, I found a new entry in the logs. A ship called the Mary Rose, reported lost in these waters in 1887, has somehow docked safely in a harbor that didn't exist when it sailed. The crew will have no memory of following our light through time, but somewhere in an archive, a maritime record has quietly changed. Another vessel saved, another tragedy undone. I keep watching the logs, tracking these changes in history. The light sweeps across the waves, and with each pass, it illuminates a different year. Some nights, when the fog rolls in thick, I swear I can see them. The ghostly ships from different eras, all following our beacon home. The automated systems keep running their protocols, guiding vessels through space and time, and I keep maintaining them. Though I'm not sure whether I'm preserving a lighthouse or a temporal anchor point. After all, what's a lighthouse keeper's duty if not to guide ships home, no matter where they sailed from or when? The deep-sea research vessel Nautilus was supposed to be mapping thermal vents near the Marianas Trench. Instead, we found something that shouldn't exist at these depths. A structure that defies our understanding of both architecture and physics. We first detected it on sonar, a perfectly geometric shape 11 kilometers down. far deeper than any human construction should be able to survive. The pressure at that depth would crush a nuclear submarine. Yet this structure stood unchanged, its angles impossibly precise. Dr. Murphy wanted to send down remote drones first, but the structure was affecting our equipment. Any device that got too close began reporting impossible data. Temperatures that fluctuated between absolute zero and the surface of the sun. Pressure readings that went negative. Radiation signatures that changed every time we measured them. We had to see it for ourselves. The Nautilus's reinforced hull could handle depths up to 12 kilometers. Though we'd never tested that limit. As we descended, the structure became clearer on our instruments. A massive polyhedron with exactly 137 faces. Each face covered in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. At 9 kilometers, we lost contact with the surface. Our emergency transponder showed we were still transmitting, but no signals were reaching us from above. We were alone with the structure, watching it grow larger in our floodlights. The patterns on its surface weren't random. They moved with purpose, flowing like liquid mercury, but maintaining perfect geometric shapes. Dr. Murphy said they looked like equations, written in a mathematical language we hadn't discovered. At 10 kilometers, we started hearing it. A low-frequency hum that resonated through the hull, making our teeth ache and our vision blur. The sound wasn't coming from the structure. It was coming from the water itself, as if the ocean was trying to tell us something. When we finally reached the structure's depth, we realized our initial scans had been wrong. It wasn't sitting on the ocean floor. It was hovering above it, sustained by some force we couldn't detect. Our instruments showed it had no mass, no temperature, no electromagnetic field. According to every sensor we had, it didn't exist. But we could see it. We could feel its presence affecting the water around us, creating currents that moved in geometric patterns, matching its surface. The whole thing pulsed with a soft, blue-green light that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. Murphy spotted the opening first, a perfectly square hole that appeared in one of the faces, revealing a corridor that seemed to extend forever. Our floodlights couldn't penetrate more than a few meters into it. The darkness inside was absolute, as if light itself behaved differently within its structure. We're still debating whether to enter. The structure's patterns have changed since we arrived, becoming more organized, more deliberate. Sometimes they form shapes that look almost like letters, almost like an invitation. The humming is getting louder now, and some of us have started to understand it. It's not just noise, it's information being transmitted through the water molecule itself, teaching us something about the nature of space, and pressure, and time. Yesterday, one of our crew members said she dreamed in geometric patterns, saw equations that explained everything about the structure's nature. When she woke up, she couldn't remember the math, but her calculations since then have been different, better, as if the structure is teaching us how to think in new ways. We're running low on supplies. Soon we'll have to choose. Return to the surface or accept the structure's invitation. The patterns on its surface have started to make sense to all of us now. They're not just equations. They're a map of something much larger than the ocean. I catalog ships for a maritime insurance company. Most cases are straightforward. Vessels left to rust after companies go bankrupt. Fishing boats torn up by storms, the occasional yacht seized for debt collection. But the Perseus was different. It had been perfectly maintained, fully fueled, and completely empty when we found it drifting off the coast of Nova Scotia. The only unusual thing aboard was the map room. Walls covered in charts and diagrams, tables strewn with navigational instruments, and in the center, a massive table with an unfinished map, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The map showed familiar coastlines, but they were wrong. Continents with different shaped islands that don't exist. Depths marked in symbols I don't recognize. At first, I assumed it was some kind of art project. Then I noticed the notes in the margins. They were written in my grandmother's handwriting. My grandmother, who disappeared 30 years ago while researching historical shipping routes. The notes were dated last week. I recognized her methodology. The careful annotations, the cross-referenced depths, the small sketches of coastline features. But the things she described couldn't exist. Notes about shores that shifted between observations, waters that flowed uphill, horizons that curved in impossible ways. The most recent notes described something she called navigational drift. Places where standard charts stopped matching reality, where compass readings pointed to different norths, where stars didn't match any known constellation. I should have reported the ship immediately. Should have turned everything over to the company. Instead, I found myself sitting at that map table night after night, studying her notes, trying to understand what she'd discovered. The map seemed to change when I wasn't looking directly at it. Coastlines shifted slightly, depths changed, new annotations appeared in my grandmother's handwriting. She was still working on it, somehow, adding new observations wherever she was. Last night, I found her sextant in one of the drawers. The readings it gave are strange. Angles that add up to more than 360 degrees. Distances that change depending on the time of day. Coordinates that don't match any known system of measurement. But when I use it to look at the horizon, I see what she saw. The way the sea curves differently in certain places. The way waves sometimes flow in impossible patterns. The way distance itself seems fluid and negotiable. The map is almost complete now. Every night, more details appear. More notes materialize in the margins. My grandmother's observations are becoming clearer, more urgent. She's not mapping physical geography anymore. She's mapping the places where reality grows thin, where the normal rules of space and navigation break down. Today, I found a new note, written directly to me. The sea doesn't just cover the earth, it contains other possibilities, other versions of reality. I've almost mapped them all. Come find me when the chart is complete. I keep watching the map, tracking its changes, learning to understand its impossible geometries. The company will want their report soon. They'll want to know what happened to the Perseus and its crew. But I don't think I'll be here when they come asking. The map is nearly finished, and somewhere out there, in the spaces between known routes, my grandmother is waiting. After all, cartography runs in the family, and some maps need to be followed, no matter where they lead. They call us deep-sea salvage specialists. We recover cargo from shipwrecks too deep for normal recovery operations. The Mariana's Diver was our most ambitious project yet. A state-of-the-art vessel, designed to work at depths beyond 10,000 meters. What we found down there wasn't cargo. It was something else entirely. The first sign something was wrong came when we detected a shipwreck that shouldn't have been possible. A wooden vessel, intact, at a depth that should have crushed it to splinters. The wood looked fresh, as if it had just sunk, but the design was ancient, like something from the age of exploration. Our initial scan showed something else impossible. Movement inside the wreck. Not currents or settling debris, but deliberate motion, as if the crew was still aboard, still going about their duties in the crushing darkness. We found the ship's log in a sealed cabin. The paper should have been disintegrated centuries ago, but it was perfectly preserved. The entries started normally enough. Departure dates, weather conditions, navigational notes. Then they changed. The captain wrote about stars that moved in the wrong direction. About water that flowed like time itself, carrying them deeper with each wave. About depths that shouldn't exist, where the pressure created spaces larger than the ocean that contained them. The final entry was dated 3 days ago. We're still reading through the log, trying to understand what happened to the ship and its crew. Each page reveals new impossibilities. The captain wrote about marine life that evolved in ways that defied biology. About currents that flowed through dimensions instead of space. About a darkness that wasn't just an absence of light, but a presence of something else. Yesterday, we found our own vessel's log. The entries matched the ancient ships exactly. Same observations, same discoveries, same growing understanding of what exists in these impossible depths. We haven't written them yet, but there they are, in our own handwriting, dated for tomorrow. The pressure gauges stopped working hours ago. They don't show a depth anymore, just an infinity symbol, slowly rotating. Through the viewports, we can see lights moving on the ancient ship. The crew is still there, still working, still sailing these dark waters that exist somewhere between time and space. Soon, we'll join them. The log says we will, and we've already written it, even though we haven't lived it yet. After all, at these depths, time flows like water, and every ship's log is both history and prophecy. I study whale songs for the Marine Bioacoustics Institute. Specifically, I analyze the patterns in humpback whale communications, trying to decode their meanings. 3 months ago, we detected something new in their songs. Fragments of human voices, somehow preserved in the whale's complex vocalizations. At first, we thought it was equipment malfunction. The voices were faint, distorted, but definitely human. Fragments of conversations, radio transmissions, even music, all carried in the subsonic frequencies of whale song. Dr. Park theorized that the whales weren't just mimicking sounds they'd heard. They were accessing some kind of acoustic memory, preserved in the ocean itself. Water, with its unique molecular structure and vast interconnected nature, might act as a storage medium for sound waves, preserving them long after their original sources had gone silent. We started focusing our hydrophones on the deeper layers of the ocean, where sound travels differently. The voices became clearer. We heard snippets of naval communications from World War II, fragments of radio broadcasts from ships long lost, even what seemed to be conversations from ancient sailing vessels. The whales weren't just carrying these sounds, they were organizing them, cataloging them in their songs. Each pod had its own archive of human voices, passed down through generations of whale song. But last week, we found something else in their songs. Not historical records, but voices from times that haven't happened yet. Future conversations, distress calls that haven't been made, commands given on ships that haven't been built. The whales are singing about things that haven't happened yet, preserving memories of a future that's still unfolding. Their songs have become a library of time itself, echoing with voices from past, present, and future. Now we spend our nights listening to their songs, transcribing voices from different times, trying to understand the patterns. The whales seem to be trying to tell us something. Something about time, about memory, about the way sound travels through more than just space. Sometimes, late at night, when the hydrophones are picking up songs from the deepest ocean layers, I hear my voice in their songs. Not as I sound now, but older, tired, recording observations about something the whales showed us, something we haven't discovered yet. The whales keep singing, carrying voices from every when, preserving them in the ocean's vast memory. We keep listening, learning to understand time through their songs. After all, in the depths of the ocean, every sound ever made still exists, echoing through the waters like memories waiting to be heard. I create tide prediction software for coastal navigation. It's mostly mathematical modeling, analyzing patterns in water movement, factoring in lunar cycles, accounting for coastal geography. But the predictions for Milton Harbor stopped making sense 6 weeks ago. The numbers showed impossible tidal patterns, water flowing against gravity, waves moving in geometric shapes, depths that changed without corresponding rises. I checked my equations, recalibrated the sensors, ran diagnostic after diagnostic. The software wasn't wrong. The tide itself was changing. I installed cameras to monitor the harbor directly. The footage showed something bizarre. Water moving in patterns that looked almost intentional, forming shapes that seemed to carry meaning, like the harbor was trying to communicate through the motion of its tides. Dr. Reyes, from the Oceanographic Institute, helped me analyze the patterns. She discovered they followed mathematical sequences, not random movements, but carefully structured equations expressed through water dynamics. The sequences became more complex over time. Simple patterns evolved into intricate mathematical expressions, describing concepts that our current physics couldn't explain. The harbor wasn't just moving strangely, it was teaching us a new kind of mathematics. We started mapping the patterns, trying to understand what they meant. Each tide brought new equations, new concepts, building on what came before. The water wasn't just flowing, it was thinking, calculating, working towards something. Last week we decoded the first clear message in the patterns. The tides weren't random or even naturally occurring. They were controlled by something deep in the harbor. Something that had learned to manipulate water at a molecular level. The patterns showed us its history, how it had evolved in the deepest parts of the ocean, learning to think using water currents as neurons, developing intelligence through the movement of tides. Milton Harbor was just the first place it had decided to make contact. Now we spend our nights by the harbor, recording its patterns, learning its mathematical language. The tide charts have become something more than navigation tools. They're translation guides, helping us understand what the water is trying to tell us. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the tides are strongest, we see more complex patterns forming, equations that describe other harbors, other contacts being made, a network of communication spreading through the world's oceans. one tide at a time. The software keeps running, generating predictions that look more like conversations than tide charts. And somewhere in the harbor's depths, something ancient and patient continues its calculations, teaching us to understand the mathematics of water. After all, every tide is a message. You know how to read it. I catalog ancient sea salt deposits for the Oceanographic Research Institute. Most people don't realize that salt crystals can trap tiny bubbles of seawater, preserving them for millions of years. We study these samples to understand how ocean chemistry has changed over time. At least, that's what we used to study, before we found the memories. It started when we analyzed a sample from a deep-sea core drilling. The salt crystals were unusual, perfectly cubic, with complex internal structures that shouldn't have been possible. When we dissolved them to study their chemical composition, something strange happened. The water retained patterns, like frozen moments of time preserved in molecular arrangements. Dr. Nakamura discovered we could read these patterns using specialized scanning equipment. They weren't just chemical signatures, they were impressions of events, moments captured in the crystal structure of ancient salt, like photographs made of molecular memory. The first images were simple: prehistoric marine life, ancient sea floors, geological events. But as we refined our techniques, we found more recent memories, shipwrecks, sea battles, events that history had forgotten. Each crystal was a library of moments, preserved in perfect detail. And we found the crystals that contained tomorrow. They grew in our lab, forming naturally from modern seawater, but the memories they contained hadn't happened yet. We saw future storms, changes in ocean currents, events that were still months or years away. The salt wasn't just preserving the past, it was somehow capturing moments from every possible when. We learned that salt doesn't just preserve, it remembers. Every grain contains centuries of memory, encoding in its crystal structure, and sometimes, when conditions are right, it grows into shapes that remember things that haven't happened yet. Now we spend our nights in the lab, dissolving carefully selected crystals, reading the memories trapped inside. Each sample contains thousands of moments, spreading across time like pages in an infinite book, the past and future preserved in molecular form, waiting to be understood. Sometimes, when I handle particularly old samples, I feel echoes of their memories directly, brief flashes of ancient seas, glimpses of events lost to time. Dr. Nakamura says the salt is teaching us how to read it properly, showing us how to understand time through chemistry. The newest crystals growing in our lab are different, more complex, more deliberate in their structure, as if the salt itself is becoming more sophisticated in how it records moments, as if it's learning to remember more clearly. After all, memory isn't just about the past. Sometimes it's about what hasn't happened yet, preserved in perfect crystalline form, waiting to be dissolved and understood. I designed deep-sea habitats for oceanographic research, reinforced structures that can withstand the crushing pressure of the abysmal plain. But nothing in my training prepared me for what we found growing at the bottom of the Challenger Deep. We first detected them through sonar, structures that looked like coral reefs but grew in impossible patterns, perfect shapes that shouldn't exist in nature, especially not at depths where the pressure could flatten a submarine. The remote probes showed us something extraordinary. They weren't coral at all, but some kind of crystalline growth that used pressure itself as a building material. Structures that didn't just resist the deep's crushing force, they were made of it, somehow converting pressure into solid form. Dr. Lin called them pressure gardens, forests of crystalline formations that grew and changed as pressure waves moved through the deep. They responded to sound, to tidal forces, to the minute vibrations of the earth itself. Each formation was like a frozen moment of force, pressure made visible. We built a research station to study them, using designs that mimicked their structure. The pressure gardens seemed to recognize this. They started growing toward our habitat, incorporating our structures into their patterns, as if they were trying to teach us how to build properly at these depths. The formations changed colors with variations in pressure, creating slowly shifting patterns of bioluminescence. Blues deepening to purples, greens flickering to gold, all pulsing in time with the ocean's rhythms. But they weren't just reacting to pressure, they were conducting it, channeling it in ways that defied physics. We discovered they were using pressure differences to communicate, sending complex patterns of compression through the water, like a nervous system made of crystallized force, transmitting information through the very pressure that should have destroyed it. The gardens are still growing, still changing. Each new formation is more complex than the last, creating structures that seem to exist in more dimensions than we can perceive. Dr. Lin says they're not just growing, they're building something. Something vast and patient and older than the ocean itself. Sometimes, late at night, we feel the pressure change in our habitat. Subtle variations that form patterns, like a language written in atmospheres of force. The gardens are trying to talk to us, teaching us to understand pressures as more than just a destructive force. Now we spend our nights mapping their growth, tracking their patterns, learning to read the language of pressure they're writing across the abysmal plain. Each new formation adds to the message, each crystal another letter in their patient communication. After all, at these depths, pressure isn't just a force to be resisted. Sometimes it's a language waiting to be understood. I monitor deep-sea hydrophone arrays for the International Maritime Organization. Most days it's routine, tracking ship movements, recording whale migrations, mapping underwater currents. But 3 months ago, we started picking up something else in the sound waves. Patterns that shouldn't exist. It began with anomalies in the frequency analysis. Waves that carried more information than they should have been able to contain. Oscillations that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, we thought it was equipment malfunction. We realized the waves themselves were changing. Dr. Santos discovered in the spectrogram analysis, the sound waves weren't just carrying acoustic information. They were carrying patterns from other types of waves, radio frequencies, light waves, even gravitational ripples, all somehow encoded in the ocean's acoustic signature. The patterns became more organized over time. What started as random anomalies evolved into complex sequences, like a vast underwater communications network that had always been there, hidden in the harmonics of normal wave motion. We learned that sound doesn't just travel through the ocean, it transforms it. Each wave carries echoes of other waves, creating a layered symphony of frequencies that encode information in ways we're just beginning to understand. The hydrophones started picking up patterns from waves that hadn't happened yet. Future storms, underwater events, changes in ocean currents, all encoded in the complex harmonics of present-day waves. As if the ocean's sound wasn't just carrying information through space, but through time as well. Now we spend our nights listening to the frequencies, mapping their patterns, learning to understand what the waves are trying to tell us. Each pattern adds another layer of complexity, another level of information encoded in the ocean's vast acoustic network. Sometimes, when the frequencies align just right, we hear something else on the harmonics. Voices that seem to speak in pure wavelengths, communicating in a language made of oscillating energy. Dr. Santos said they've always been there, waiting for us to learn how to listen properly. The hydrophone arrays keep recording, capturing each new pattern, each complex frequency. Somewhere in the depths, something ancient continues its broadcast, teaching us to understand the true nature of waves. After all, every oscillating message, every frequency a key to understanding what the ocean has been trying to tell us all along. I record marine mammal vocalizations off the coast of Scotland, mostly seals and whales, documenting their migration patterns and social behaviors. But last winter, during a storm that kept most boats in harbor, I recorded something different. It came from a small cove known in local folklore as Selkie's Rest. The locals still tell stories about the seal folk who could shed their skins and walk on land. Most researchers dismiss these tales as myth, but there's something about that cove that makes you wonder. The recording was unlike anything in our database. It had elements of seal calls, but layered with something that sounded almost human. Not just mimicry, but true speech, sung in a language older than any still spoken on the islands. An elderly woman in the village recognized it. Her grandmother had been a keeper of the old stories, and she said this was a Selkie's morning song, sung only when one of their kind was the last of their bloodline. According to legend, it carried memories of their entire species, preserved in melody. I spent weeks analyzing the records. Hidden in the harmonics were sounds that seemed impossible. Echoes of ancient shores long since swallowed by the rising seas. Calls of creatures that went extinct thousands of years ago. Voices speaking in languages lost to time. The song appeared again during the next storm, closer to shore. Through my equipment, I saw a seal, larger than any recorded species, its eyes reflecting moonlight in colors that shouldn't exist. It sang directly toward my hydrophone, as if ensuring its song would be preserved. The old stories say that when the last Selkie sings, they're not just mourning their kind, they're passing their memories to someone who will keep them safe. The village woman says I didn't choose to record that song. The last Selkie chose me to hear it. Now I spend my nights by the cove, recording equipment ready. The song comes more often, teaching me something about the sea that science never knew. I'm learning to hear the layers in it. Histories hidden in harmony. Secrets carried in silence between notes. Sometimes, when the moon is full and the tide is high, I see shapes moving beneath the waves. Not quite seal, not quite human. Watching to see what I'll do with the memories they've given me. The last Selkie is still out there, still singing, ensuring their kind won't be forgotten. After all, some songs aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be remembered. The fishing village of Port Haven has always had its secrets, ways to ensure good catches, rituals to calm the storm, offerings to whatever lives in the deep waters offshore. My father taught me all of them before he disappeared, like every other fisher who stayed too long on the winter sea. But he taught me something else too, how to hear the deep voices that whisper between waves, how to understand what the tide brings in from places where the ocean floor drops away into darkness. Most importantly, he taught me about the bargain our village made centuries ago. The stories say our ancestors found something sleeping in the deep waters, something vast and ancient that dreamed of cities that sank beneath the waves before humans learned to build. In exchange for fresh fish and small offerings, it would ensure our boats returned safely, our nets came up full. But it asked for something else too. Every generation, it would choose a child from the village to learn its language, to understand its dreams, to serve as a bridge between its world and ours. My father was one. Now I am too. I first heard its voice during last winter's storm. Not words exactly, but impressions of thoughts older than language itself. Images of ancient seas teeming with life we've never discovered. Memories of times when the stars were different. It showed me things in my dreams. Glimpses of its true form sleeping in the deep, vast and beautiful and terrible all at once. Tentacles that could encircle islands. Eyes that had watched continents drift apart. A mind that thought in epochs rather than moments. The villagers pretend not to notice when I walk the beaches at night, collecting the strange things that wash ashore. Artifacts from civilizations that vanished beneath the waves. Tokens of the bargain our ancestors made. They don't ask about the lights that sometimes shine from the deep waters or the shadows that follow our fishing boats home. But they leave their offerings. Fresh fish placed on old stone altars, small treasures dropped into deep water. They know the bargain must be maintained. The deep one still dreams beneath our waters, and through me, it dreams of the surface world too. Sometimes I see my father in my dreams. He's not dead, just elsewhere, serving as an ambassador to the deep one's court. In a palace made of water pressure and ancient stone. He shows me wonders that human eyes were never meant to see, teaches me secrets that human minds weren't meant to know. The village children watch me from a distance now, wondering which of them will be chosen next. The deep one is patient. It thinks in centuries, plans in millennia. It will wait until the right child is born, one who can hear its voice as clearly as I do. After all, some bargains last forever, passed down through generations like the tide itself. I curate a small maritime museum on a lonely stretch of coast. Most of our collection is typical. Ship's logs, navigation instruments, artifacts, recovered from local wrecks, but in the basement, locked away from public view, we keep the Siren's collection. It was donated anonymously in 1892, a vast assortment of objects gathered from every age of seafaring. Each piece came with a story attached, written in a flowing hand that never seemed to dry completely. Stories of how they were collected, of the ships they were taken from, of the songs that lured sailors to their doom. The stories say sirens don't just take lives, they take memories too, preserving them in objects that held meaning for their victims. A captain's sextant that still points to ports that sank beneath the waves centuries ago. A sailor's lucky coin that grows warm when storms approach. A love letter whose words change to reveal different fates its writer might have had. I started researching the collection properly last year. Each artifact led to historical records of shipwrecks, of vessels lost in calm seas on clear nights, always with reports of beautiful singing just before communications ceased, always with a single survivor to tell the tale. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized these weren't just trophies. The sirens were preserving something. Moments in maritime history that would have been lost otherwise. Songs that hadn't been sung in centuries. Maps to places that existed only in legend. The writing on the collection's documentation changes sometimes. New notes appear in that same flowing script, adding details about recently acquired items. The collection is still growing, still being curated by something that thinks in songs and stories. Last month, I found a new artifact on my desk. A shell that holds the sound of waves from a coast that vanished beneath the sea 10,000 years ago. The note with it was fresh, the ink still wet with seawater. They know I've been studying their collection, and they approve. Now I spend my nights in the basement, documenting each piece, learning the true history of the seas through objects touched by siren song. Sometimes when it's very quiet, I hear singing from inside the cases, fragments of melodies that make me understand why sailors would follow them into the deep. The official records say the collection was donated by a wealthy maritime enthusiast, but the real curators still visit, leaving new pieces, adding to their museum of memories. They're teaching me their songs, showing me how to preserve the stories that history has forgotten. After all, some collections aren't just meant to be kept, they're meant to be sung. I map uncharted harbors for maritime navigation companies. Most are small coves or forgotten inlets, places modern ships don't visit anymore. But last autumn, in a fog bank off Newfoundland, I found a harbor that wasn't on any chart, a place where lost ships go to rest. The entrance only appears in certain kinds of fog, when the light plays tricks with distance and direction. My instruments failed as I approached, compass spinning wildly, depth finder showing impossible readings. But through the mist, I saw masts, hundreds of them. Ships from every era floated peacefully at anchor. Ancient galleons beside modern freighters, fishing boats next to clipper ships. Each one had been claimed by the sea at some point, reported lost in storms or simply vanished without trace. Now they rested here, in this impossible harbor that existed somewhere between the world of the living and the realm of the lost. The ships weren't empty. Ghostly crews went about their duties, maintaining the vessels with practiced care. They moved like memories given form, each one preserving the exact moment their ship had been lost. Some seemed unaware they had perished, while others watched me with knowing eyes as I passed. A weathered captain on a 19th century whaler told me the harbor's story. It forms naturally in places where many ships have been lost, a kind of sanctuary created from collective memory and shared fate. The fog that reveals it is the breath of drowning sailors. The water beneath it holds the weight of final moments. The harbor provides peace for these lost vessels and their crews. Here, they're not wreckage on the seafloor or entries in insurance reports. They remain what they always were, proud ships with purpose, sailors with duties to perform. The harbor gives them endless voyages that never need to end. I spent 3 days recording details of this place. Though my modern equipment refused to function, I had to use the old ways. Sextant and compass, paper charts and hand soundings. The ghostly crews helped, sharing knowledge of depths and currents that no living sailor had ever measured. When I finally left, They gave me a gift, a small brass compass that only points toward the harbor. It doesn't work most days, but sometimes, in the right kind of fog, it remembers. The needle stirs, pointing toward a place where lost ships find their way home. Now I spend foggy nights following that compass, mapping routes that exist only in memory. The Ghost Fleet's harbor is out there, offering shelter to ships that would otherwise be forgotten. Sometimes I hear their bells in the distance, ringing across waves that bridge the gap between what was lost and what was found. After all, some harbors aren't meant to be charted, they're meant to be remembered. I tend the hydroponic gardens on Deep Station 7, one of the underwater research facilities studying abyssal ecosystems. Most of our work focuses on developing plants that can thrive in deep sea conditions. But something else is growing in my garden now. Something that came from much deeper than our sensors can reach. It started with a strange growth on the glass wall of the station that faced the abyss. Not algae or typical deep sea organisms, but something that looked almost like coral made of shadows. It responded to the light from our hydroponic systems, growing in patterns that mimicked our carefully tended plants. The station's marine biologists were baffled. The growth didn't match any known species, and its cellular structure seemed to change every time we tried to analyze it. But it wasn't threatening our integrity or systems, so they approved my request to study it alongside our regular cultivation projects. That's when I noticed it was learning. The shadow coral began mimicking our hydroponics more accurately, developing structures that looked like dark reflections of our plants. But it improved on them, creating hybrid forms that could photosynthesize using the faint light of bioluminescent creatures. Each new growth showed more sophistication, structures that combined plant and animal characteristics in ways that shouldn't be possible. Beautiful, impossible gardens blooming in the pressure and darkness of the sea. The shadow coral wasn't just copying our plants, it was teaching them how to truly thrive in the abyss. Our regular crops began to change, influenced by their dark counterparts. Tomatoes that could grow in total darkness, lettuce that drew nutrients directly from seawater, flowers that bloomed in impossible colors visible only in the deep sea's alien light. The other stations reported similar growths appearing on their outer walls, each one different but all working toward the same goal: teaching surface life how to adapt to the sea, as if something down there had decided to help us colonize its realm. Now my gardens grow in ways that defy biology, producing food that sustains both body and mind. The shadow coral continues its patient work, showing us secrets of adaptation and survival that evolution took millions of years to develop. Sometimes, late in the night, I see movements in the darkness beyond our lights. Vast shapes that might be other gardens, tended by something that learned about cultivation long before humans existed. They watch our progress, guiding us toward understanding how to truly live in their world. After all, every garden needs a teacher, even ones that grow in the heart of the abyss. I authenticate maritime artifacts for private collectors. Most are straightforward: ship's wheels, old compasses, personal effects recovered from documented wrecks. But when the mariner's reliquary approached me about their collection, I found pieces that defied historical record and natural law alike. The reliquary itself was hidden in an old lighthouse, its collection spread through rooms that seemed to extend impossibly downward into bedrock. Each chamber held artifacts that shouldn't exist, pieces of legend and myth made solid and real. A jar of water that never freezes, taken from the heart of the Northwest Passage. A compass that points toward lost Atlantis, its needle trembling with ancient memory. A ship in a bottle that shows different scenes from maritime history, depending on how the light hits it. The curator, an ageless woman with sea glass eyes, explained that the reliquary doesn't just preserve artifacts, it keeps them alive. Each piece continues its story, evolving and changing like the sea itself. They're not just remnants of maritime history, they're pieces of the sea's memory, crystallized into physical form. I began cataloging the collection, documenting impossible objects with descriptions that strained credibility. A mermaid's comb that still holds songs from the underwater cities. A piece of driftwood that grants visions of every shore it's ever touched. A captain's log that writes itself, recording journeys that haven't happened yet. The deeper I went into the collection, the more I realized these weren't just curiosities. They were pieces of a vast puzzle, each one revealing a different aspect of the sea's true nature. The reliquary wasn't just preserving them, it was using them to tell a story that began before humans first set foot on a boat. Last week, I found a new room, one that hadn't existed before. Inside was a single artifact, a shell that holds the sound of the first wave that ever broke on Earth's shore. The curator says it appeared because I was ready to hear it, ready to understand what the collection has been trying to teach me. Now I spend my nights in the reliquary's endless rooms, documenting wonders that shouldn't exist. Each artifact adds another piece to the story, another glimpse of what the sea really is. The collection grows and changes like a living thing, revealing new secrets to those who learn to look properly. Sometimes, in the deepest chambers, I find artifacts that remember me, pieces I haven't cataloged yet, but which hold memories of me discovering them. The reliquary knows what I'll find before I find it, guiding me through its mysteries like the sea guides ships to shore. After all, some collections aren't just gatherings of objects. They're chapters in a story the sea has been telling since the first tide rolled in. I monitor deep-sea thermal vents for geological research. The cameras we use can see for miles through the darkness, tracking how the vents affect ocean currents. 3 months ago, we started seeing something in our footage that made us question everything we knew about marine life. It appeared gradually, first as strange movements in the background, then as massive shadows that seemed to breathe with the ocean itself. Something ancient was stirring around our deepest monitoring stations, something that made whale pods look like minnows in comparison. Our size calculations were impossible. The creature's body extended beyond our camera range, but what we could measure suggested something nearly 40 miles long. Its movement affected water temperature across entire ocean regions. When it shifted, currents changed. When it breathed, thermal vents pulsed in response. Dr. Harrison found records of similar sightings in ancient maritime documents. Tales of sea serpents weren't exaggerations or myth. They were glimpses of something that normally stayed too deep to be seen. Something that had lived in Earth's ocean since before the continents took their current shape. We tracked its habits, learned its patterns. It wasn't just one creature, but the last of its kind. A leviathan that had watched life crawl from the seas, seen empires rise and fall, endured every extinction event Earth had ever experienced. Now it spent most of its time sleeping, dreaming dreams that affected ocean temperatures worldwide. The locals who lived near our deepest monitoring station had always known about it. Their legends called it the World Serpent, the Old One, the Current Maker. They left offerings at sea, not to appease it, but to thank it for maintaining the ancient balance of the oceans. We've never seen its full form, just pieces. A fin larger than a cargo ship, scales that could be mistaken for moving islands, eyes deep enough to hold entire ecosystems. But we've learned to track it by what it affects rather than what we can see. The way deep currents shift around its body, how entire marine populations migrate in response to its movements. Sometimes, late at night, we see it more clearly through our deepest cameras. Not hunting or feeding, it's long past needing such things. Just moving through its domain, maintaining patterns of current and temperature that have shaped ocean life for millions of years. The other research stations have started tracking it too. Together, we're learning its habits, understanding its role in the ocean's health. It's not just a creature, it's a living piece of Earth's history, maintaining balances modern science is only beginning to understand. After all, some creatures aren't meant to be studied, they're meant to be witnessed. I study bioluminescent life forms in the deep Atlantic. Most are tiny creatures, bacteria, plankton, small fish that make their own light. But in a remote trench off the Azores, we found something else. A garden of light tended by something that didn't want to be seen. It started with unusual patterns in the bioluminescence, not the random flashes of hunting fish or mating displays, but organized designs that spread for miles, like someone had planted fields of living light on the ocean floor, cultivating them into specific shapes. Our submersible's cameras caught glimpses of the gardener, tentacles bigger than our vessel, moving with deliberate care among the lights, not hunting or threatening, but tending, carefully maintaining these deep-sea constellations with the precision of an artist. The local fishermen knew about it. They called it the light tender, the ancient gardener. Their stories said it had lived in these waters for centuries, cultivating gardens of light that helped guide fish migrations and maintain the health of deep-sea ocean ecosystems. We learned it wasn't what old stories claimed the Kraken to be, not a mindless monster hunting ships, but something more like a shepherd, an intelligent creature that had learned to farm the deep, creating sustainable ecosystems that benefited all ocean life. Its gardens served many purposes. The patterns of light attracted specific species of fish, maintaining feeding grounds that had existed for millennia. The bioluminescent creatures it cultivated provided food and shelter for countless deep-sea species. Even the chemistry of the water changed around its gardens, creating perfect conditions for marine life to thrive. Sometimes we see it more clearly, a vast form moving through its garden of stars, adjusting patterns of light and life with tentacles gentle enough to handle the smallest creatures. Its eye, when we caught a glimpse of it, held an intelligence that made us realize how little we understood about life in the deep. The gardens changed with the seasons, different patterns blooming in response to migration times and breeding cycles. The Kraken maintains them all, its knowledge passed down through generations of its kind, each one learning to tend these crucial deep-sea ecosystems. Now we study its techniques, learning how it creates sustainable marine environments that modern science is only beginning to understand. Each night brings new patterns in the deep, new lessons from a creature that learned the art of cultivation long before we existed. After all, some gardens grow best in darkness, tended by ancient hands that know the deep's true nature. I track whale migrations across the Pacific. Usual stuff. Plotting routes, recording songs, monitoring population health. But last season, we started picking up something else in our hydrophone recordings. Songs that shouldn't exist, coming from creatures that shouldn't still be alive. They began as weird harmonics in our normal whale recordings, deeper notes than any known species could produce. Complex melodies that seemed to carry messages our instruments could barely detect. When we traced the sounds to their source, we found something that challenged everything we knew about marine life. They looked like whales, but wrong somehow. Bigger than blues, with features that resembled ancient species we knew only from fossils. A pod of living memories, singing songs that had echoed through Earth's oceans since before we evolved. Dr. McCarthy found cave paintings that showed similar creatures, depicted by cultures separated by thousands of miles and years. Not whales as we know them, but their ancestors, survivors from a time when giants ruled the seas, preserving their ancient songs through countless generations. They weren't just singing, they were teaching. Modern whales gathered around them, learning songs that contained millions of years of oceanic history, migration routes older than continents, feeding grounds that had existed since the last ice age, dangers that lurked in the deep. The pod appeared during crucial migration times, guiding other marine life along routes that had been used since before humans first built boats. Their songs carried memories of how the oceans changed, knowledge that modern species needed to survive in warming seas. We tracked them across the Pacific, recording songs that contained more information than all our marine databases combined. They knew where plankton blooms would appear months in advance, when storms would force migrations to shift, how currents would change with the seasons. The regular whales treated them with what looked like reverence. Entire pods would fall silent when the ancient ones sang, listening to wisdom carried in songs that had been passed down since before their species existed. Even other marine life seemed to understand their importance. Sharks and fish followed their guidance without question. Now we spend our nights on the research vessel, recording songs that tell the ocean's true history. The ancient pod appears more often, as if they know their knowledge is needed in changing seas. Their songs grow more complex, teaching lessons that took millions of years to learn. After all, some songs aren't just music. They're memories of when the oceans were young, preserved in voices that have never fallen silent.